morning.
Morning. Morning, everybody. Welcome to this week. Beautiful today.
It's good to be live for a change.
Yeah, we've had a bit of technical situations. Yeah, all beyond our own control, I would say. But that's part of the fun. Anyway, welcome to today. We are in our last session on Genesis, seeing Genesis through ancient art. So this is it. We say goodbye. Move on. Today we are dealing with the last little portion of Genesis, which is basically the life of Joseph. And Joseph is important to us because it brings us into Egypt. Right. And once we're in Egypt, Tori, you know what's coming next. One of the biggest events of Israelite history and consciousness, Exodus, right? The Exodus is a huge event for Jews, but also for Christians, because a lot of the way we see Jesus is kind of like the new Moses. We kind of know that a gospel writer like the author of Matthew, the book of Matthew, for instance, kind of models Jesus on Moses. It's a huge event for everybody. We're not going to get there today, but this is why we need to end up kind of like in Egypt, right? So, what? Oh, sorry, I pressed the button here and my pages jumped all the way down to the bottom. Terrible. Give me one. Oh, it's bombing out. You know, if it's not the one thing, it's the other.
Moral of the story?
It's literally every time I press onto the page I should go, it jumps back to page 8 every single time. Okay, guys. Crisis. Come on.
What page are you supposed to be?
I'm supposed to be on the bottom. I press 21.
Go. Go slow.
Okay.
Slow and easy.
No, not slow and easy.
Yes, if you go quick it comes.
Alrighty. Okay, so we're in Genesis 36 to 50, and that's the end of the whole story. We've come all the way from Adam to Jacob having his name changed to become Israel. Right? The writers of Genesis give us a good history of tracing back almost everything. You can kind of add the numbers together and find out that Adam lived about 4000 BC. Like, that's how much detail they give us. Now, whether we can actually use that as historical timeline, that's an issue that has been much debated. But as much as they trace from Adam to Jacob, they don't leave out some of these side nations, characters that become side nations. For instance, like Ishmael, Cain, and Esau, which we recently met. They even use some of the ancient chapter headings, like these are the descendants of, to help us not forget, like characters like Ishmael, for instance. And here again, one is used for Esau before we can move forward. So the list of the kings of Edom in chapter 36 is connected to, and I quote, the writer says, a time when no king ruled over Israel. All right, so we just need to stop there for a moment, and these little things are important. If this was written by somebody that lived in the time of Esau, that comment makes zero sense. The only way that comment makes sense, inserted by the writers or the final redactors, is that it is written from a time when they knew that there would be kings that rule over Israel. And we know that that comes from, let's say, David or Saul, and David as the first king. And that puts us, guys, almost 800 years later. So this is one of the ways in which scholars date these documents, because they say, look, this couldn't have been written before a time that there were actually
like
kings.
Saying there were no calculators
exactly.
in this age. But how did they know there was going to be calculators?
Exactly, Tori. So this is one of the ways we know that there's no ways that this account was finally redacted and written down before the time of the kings. Now that gives us massive amounts of time between the time that the story actually happens and the time that this is actually written down. Okay. So these little things are important. But Genesis 37 brings us to the 10th and the final one of these headings, called These Are the Descendants of. And this one is dedicated to the line of Jacob, or now Israel. Finally, one of these belong to the main character of the whole story. And it is traced through Jacob, or Israel, and through his son Joseph. Once again, Joseph is not the eldest. Should be through the eldest. It doesn't go through the eldest. It goes through Joseph, which is the eldest son of Rachel, the beloved wife, of course, of Jacob. He's the favorite of the favorite wife. And Joseph, of course, plays a vital role to the survival of this nation. Because once again, this nation, this group now of Israel and his sons are going to find themselves in the promised land. And what's going to hit them? Famine. Now, this is not the first, not the second, not the third time that we see this. Is a reoccurring theme in Genesis. In the promised land, there's going to be famine. And there might be a time that you have to move out of the promised land to return to it. So this theme is exactly what a contemporary 6th century group of Israelites would have expected. They were removed for a while from the promised land, now ready to go back into it. So the writers seem to emphasize this over and over again, as we saw last week. There's an account of Abraham's having to go to Egypt. Then there's an account of Isaac having to go to Egypt. Same name, Philistines in that case, Abimelech. The point is that from time to time, Israelites have to be removed because of a famine, because things go wrong, but then they get to come back. All right. So this happens once again, and this is the real one. This is the big one, where everybody moves into Egypt through the events that were about to unfold. So we get the character of Joseph, which is probably one of the most famous stories, I guess, in the book of Genesis. Joseph is this beloved son of Jacob. Jacob shows him favoritism. That does not go down well with the other older brothers. They don't like this. Jacob gives him a cloak of many colors, as it's come down to us. The original Hebrew is quite strange there, but anyway, we'll take it as that. And they hate him even more for that. And on top of all of that, Joseph has all these dreams about his brothers bowing before him. Terrible dreams. And he doesn't keep it to himself either. He actually goes and he tells them about how they will bow in front of him. So that is the reason why Joseph eventually is hated so much they want to kill him. The voice of reason kind of prevails, and they don't kill him, but they throw him in a pit. And he gets sold off to Ishmaeli traders that take him. He ends up in Egypt. Now, you know the rest of the story, and I'm not here to really tell you the story of Joseph. Joseph wasn't a flawless character either, but somehow he ends up in Egypt, and because of him, Potiphar's house is blessed. He ends up with Potiphar, one of the senior officials of Pharaoh, and Potiphar's house gets blessed, but his wife has an agenda. She wants to seduce Joseph. She doesn't succeed, but she eventually gets him landed in jail. And now he's in jail, the promised son of the son, the guy who is the kind of like the hope of all of Israel, because guess what's about to happen? Famine's about to hit Jacob and his whole family again. He's in jail. So he interprets dreams for the baker and the cupbearer of the king, the Pharaoh. And after a long story, they remember Joseph once they were released, and they're working for the Pharaoh again. The Pharaoh now has dreams that he doesn't know how to interpret. They remember Joseph. They call Joseph out. Joseph has the solution to the famine, and Joseph gets promoted and basically becomes second in command in Egypt, like a great success story. And what hits next is the famine. Jacob, Israel, and the other brothers are in the promised land. They get hit with famine. And so Joseph is used as a tool, according to the writers, to bring Jacob and his sons back into Egypt. And they seem to get put in quite a comfortable position. Well, there's a lot of reconciling going on between him and the brothers, and a little bit of treachery and deceit here and there. But the end of the story is that Jacob and his family and all his sons are in Egypt, and they're actually having quite a good laugh there under the rulership of Joseph. Now, of course, some of the very last verses of Genesis 50 is Joseph making his very well-known speech. And I'm just going to read it for you quickly. This is chapter 45, 7 to 8. God sent me before you to preserve you, a remnant on earth, and to keep you alive. So it was that you did not send me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and a lord of all his house, and a ruler over the land of Egypt. So the brothers get to meet him face to face. It's embarrassing. They got to swallow their old, the words they spoke against him, the treachery they committed against him. But nevertheless, Joseph has this heart of forgiveness again, and there's a reconciliation, same as Esau and Jacob, once again, Joseph and his brothers. Reconciliation, everybody ends up nicely. So the season finale, the last couple of verses of Genesis, ends with Israel, Jacob and his family, escaping the famine, and they enter Egypt. And Joseph then says the last couple of words in Genesis chapter 15. It's kind of like a prophetic promise he utters. He says that God will visit them and bring them out. And this, bring them out, out of Egypt, and his bones will also be carried out. So Joseph dies, I think, at the age of 110 in Egypt. But the point is that, when you're watching a mini-series and you're watching the first season, and you get to the last episode of the first season, and in the old days, you wouldn't have the next season yet. And everything is hanging on those last couple of moments of the end of this first season, the last episode of the first season. This one ends with this. You're now in Egypt, but God will visit you, and he's going to pull you out from this Egyptian place. Now, of course, at this point, they're not slaves yet, so, they might have questions as to why, because it's lekker here. Our brother is the main kokadua, but that's how the season finale ends. And so Genesis brings us all the way from the formations of the cosmos till it places our main protagonist, Israel, in Egypt and leaves them with a promise by Joseph, the one who rescued them, that God will visit them again, and he's going to take them out of the land of Egypt. Because remember, in the back of the mind of the writers, this is about the promise for the land and for the nation. Now, Israel and his family is still very small at this point, and they don't have their own land. They're in someone else's land. Even if they are second in charge, they're not going to take over Egypt. There's still this thing in the writers that they're instilling into the audience they're writing towards, or they're writing to, is that there's a promise here that's still unfolding. This is not the end. This is not how Israel ends. Israel does not end in Egypt under the control of the Pharaoh. And that's kind of how Genesis ends. So let's move to a final summary today of our whole series. Everything we've learned, everything we've walked through. Of course, we've not been exhaustive. We've really just touched on certain things. But the main point for us was to show how, as far as we can see, how scholars view the context from which Genesis is written, and possibly how an Israelite living in the 6th century would have understood the stories in there, and how it would have applied to their contemporary context. All right, so let's do that together, and then I'm going to make a couple of final statements, but I'm trying to just bring everything together today. Genesis is the first season in the epic mini-series called the Torah, the 5 books. The Torah, of course, climaxes in the giving of the Torah, the law, and the legislative part of the covenant, the nation of Israel. True to its name, then, Genesis, origin, gives us an account of the origins of the nation of Israel. Where do they come from? Who were their ancestors? Who is their God? How does their God differ from the other pagan gods around them? What is their God-given destiny as a people? And where do their enemies come from? And who are their enemies? So it seems like Genesis kind of lays out the ground for a contemporary socio-political sphere in which Edom and the Philistines and the Babylonians and the Egyptians all play into the story. And then finally, how did they end up in Egypt? It seems to me, from the reading I've done, that there's a kernel of history within the idea that there's Israelites that came from Egypt. Maybe not the whole bunch, but maybe some Levitical tribe or a priestly order that came from there. And it seems like that was in the memory of the Israelites, and they needed to explain why, or they had to legitimize that this was a legitimate contingency, or not contingency, what's the right word? Group of people that came into their midst. But anyway, that's something for a completely different time. Now, some hard facts, or let me rather not say facts, let me say some hard considerations, some difficult things we need to think through. Now, it's easy just to move on from this and say, okay, great, okay, let's move on. But we can't just move on from this. We need to think about, what does this mean for us as Christians?
Yeah.
When we read the book of Genesis, what are we doing with the book of Genesis, knowing what we know now, knowing the things that Paul would not have known, knowing the things that all the great church fathers would not have known, knowing the things that the great reformers would not have known. Us in the last 150, 200 years have access, privileged access to a lot of knowledge that they didn't have, and we can understand these books from a much more logical, historical point of view. What do we do with that? Okay, so let's start here. Most scholars consider the book of Genesis not as strict history, right? In the way, at least, that me and you today, the modern human, thinks about history, but rather ancient stories that were shaped by later authors to form an origin story, an account of the nation of Israel. Thus, many of these stories are theologically driven more than what they are driven by actual history, right? Now, we're not saying that there's no history in them, but we are saying that the parts that are strictly historical are very small, and that over centuries of oral distribution and transmission, and in the light of final shaping in the 6th century, which is obvious to us, and we're going to give some reasons for that, we cannot read this as strict history. Would be irresponsible to do so. Okay, so here are the reasons why most scholars, and the reasons are my words, but it's roughly an account of the reasons why scholars do not read Genesis as strict history. Okay, so the first one is something we've met. It's the numerous amount of doublets inside of the account of Genesis and the Torah, but we're dealing with Genesis. So in Genesis, we saw a couple of doublets. For instance, we saw the two creation stories that at points they don't gel together, they don't fit together. The order of creation is not right. There's a lot of things that don't fit together. They are obviously two different stories that portray God differently, and they have different functions. We have the flood account, which we know that in the flood account there's a story of where animals are classified as clean and unclean, and so many of this and so many of that. And then the other part of the story, clean and unclean doesn't matter, and there's then so many animals. So the numbers don't match. It seems like there's two stories that were put together in the flood narrative or the flood account. Then we have doublet genealogies. We also have this idea of Isaac and his father Abraham, who went through the exact same thing with the king, the Philistine king Abimelech in Gerar. Seems to be a double story which is applied to a different patriarch. So there are the amount of doublets that are in the text indicates to us that these stories were drawn from multiple surviving sources, right? Not just one pure source. They were included by the scribes in order to preserve both traditions, right? It also tells us something about the mindset of the scribes or the editors, the final redactors of the Torah. They were more concerned with preserving both stories than to try and figure out which one is right and chuck the other one out. Their mindset about what they were doing is different from maybe the mindset that modern Christians want Genesis to be. We want it to be an accurate historical account of the origins of humankind, let alone. But it doesn't seem like the redactors of century had that as their primary concern. For them, it was more important. Okay, we have two stories about the flood and which animals go in the ark. Well, the one side says this is what we have and this is important to us. The other side said this is what we have and this is important to us. And they weave them together. All right, so it tells us something. It was more important to them that the duplicity of the accounts were preserved rather than to try and figure out which story is the real story. So we have multiple sources that sometimes stand at odds with each other. Okay. The second reason why we don't read Genesis as pure and strict history is because of the numerous amount of anachronistic data points. And we went through them as we went through the book of Genesis, and I'm just going to mention them quickly for those who might be tuning in for the first time. Things like the mention of Philistines that were there in the time of Abraham and Isaac, which we know with archaeology, we can actually prove that they only came much, much later. It's anachronistic data, right? The idea that Abraham was an observer of the statutes and basically the law is pictured as a law-abiding Israelite. We know the law wasn't there at that time. The idea, as we've mentioned, that there were distinction between clean and unclean animals already in the time of Noah. That's something that comes a lot later in Israelite history. The idea of first fruit offering between Cain and Abel is something that comes much later in the Israeli history. And then the one we mentioned today, the mentioning that there was no king at that time, means that it was written much later. In other words, the point here is simply that it's become clear that the final form of the text was written down in a time that is much later than the time in which the stories were reported to have taken place. They were possibly started to be written down no earlier than 1000 BC, right, in the time of the first kings, Saul, David, Solomon. The early times of the kings of Israel. And they were shaped into the form that we have today, most probably, in the 6th century. That's another 300 years later. So that's something we need to take into account. We know that these stories were not written down as it happened. We know that there's really no chance that Moses wrote any of this down, because that's a traditional author for us as Christians is Moses. But really there's zero evidence. Not even the internal evidence of these books point to Moses. They actually point away from Moses. So it's clear to us that it was written at a time much later. Now, what happens when you're writing something 1,000 years after it happened? You just don't, there's really just no chance of actually having the actual story. Right. The last thing we mention is the amount of anti-Babylonian rhetoric. In other words, there's an agenda behind the writing. They are not writing pure history. They are writing polemic. They are writing an agenda-based account of their origins. Now, some of the anti-Babylonian rhetoric we dealt with, but let me mention them quickly. Number one, Genesis 1 seems to be a different version of a Mesopotamian or Babylonian formation, cosmos creation formation account that was already much older than the Jewish one. The Tower of Babel story seems to be a polemic against the way that the Babylonians built ziggurats to get to God, and moving away from that is important, and that is chaos and confusion. The morally adjusted version of the flood narrative for the Israelites, stating that not as with the other Mesopotamian accounts where the gods were basically angry because people were noisy and killed everybody. Now, in the biblical account, God is unhappy with the evil that is in man's heart. So they adjust those narratives. They have an agenda behind what they're putting down. And then also the idea that Abraham leaves Babylon and separates from its land and separates from its religion. So there's all these themes come together as a kind of like an anti-Babylonian rhetoric, which tells us that a lot of, at least in Genesis now, a lot of this is written in reaction to what the Israelites might have experienced in Babylonian exile. It indicates to us that the final compilers of the text were influenced by the Babylonian realities, which they most certainly would have encountered in their Babylonian exile. And there seems to be a clear agenda to counter Babylonian narratives. Israelites were writing alternatives to assert the moral and the power supremacy of their God over the pagan or Babylonian gods, the gods of the other peoples. Right, so from that in which the stories are reported to have happened, the time from which these stories were reported to have happened until the time they were written down, as we've said, has been literally centuries. And in cases like, for instance, Adam, we're talking about 3.5 millennia. We're talking about 1,400 years for Abraham, just rough, plus minus 100.
Yeah.
We're talking about 1,000 years after Joseph. These are long, long, long times for people who are, for most periods of this time, completely illiterate. Even by the time we get to the 6th century, we really only have elites that are able to read and write.
And how long do they think it took to write? What time frame was the book of Genesis written in?
Well, that's impossible to...
Not hundreds of years and then pieced together.
No, well, that's impossible
Dunno.
to I think, to assess, because we don't have any documents or written documents that predate the Torah we have. And what we know from the evidence that's available, the final version of this comes from the 6th century. So we're talking about a very long time in which people were transmitting these stories. If these stories have an ancient source, right? They've been transmitted for millennia or centuries, transmitted orally, and obviously each generation, as we've seen with this 6th century generation, who actually finally penned it down, they shape it according to their context. Now imagine each 100 years, let's say every 100 years, these stories are told. They are retold in context, so that by the time we get to the 6th century, we're just not dealing with history anymore. We are dealing with a shaped history, if we can call it that, theological stories that are there for the benefit of Israel, the agenda of Israel, to show who their God is, where they come from, etc., as we've said before. When we consider, in addition to this, the final shaping that takes place by the final editors in the 6th century, it stands to reason, in fact, we are not dealing with accurate history when we engage a book like Genesis. We are dealing at best with ancient stories shaped through the centuries of oral transmission, finally, as we know, shaped again by those who were able to pen them down, redact them, put them together in the 6th century for the conditions and the purposes of a nation that is in Babylonian distress. A question then remains, and I'm ending off with this today, is how should a Christian be reading Genesis? Like if these things that scholars are telling us are true. Now, of course, there are a lot of people that believe they are not true. Many times this will be apologists, people who have a priori, like a presupposition that no, the Bible is 100% true, and then they go to the Bible. Now, scholars don't approach the Bible like that. They read it for what it says and come to conclusions based on what it says. Where apologists, unfortunately, they make decisions, dogmatic decisions, for which there's no proof, and then use this as rules that can't be violated. It's not a good way. It's not. I wouldn't even consider it a scholarly, really, approach, because it's just not that. But obviously, there are people that disagree with the scholarly consensus, and I don't think that anything I've put forward in the last 8 weeks will sit outside of mainstream scholarly consensus. So what I'm trying to say is that most scholars who are not dogmatic about the Bible, these are their conclusions. Okay, point again. How should we Christians read Genesis? How should we read it? What should we read it for if we're coming to realize that we're not dealing with strict history? Okay, so first point, these are my conclusions. We shouldn't be reading Genesis as history accounts. We shouldn't be using them based on their dates and based on the fact that this exactly happened like this, as the writer says it did. We shouldn't be doing that. It's dangerous ground for many, many reasons, but for the first reason, we cannot prove any of this stuff. There is no archaeological record to back anything in Genesis, really, in that sense. They are shaped. We need to recognize that they are shaped. In some cases, they are embellished, and they are, in some cases, mythicized. In other words, they are elaborated to such a point that it falls almost in the character or in the category of myth. Myth not being something that's made up out of whole cloth, but myth being a story that's more than real,
Mm.
to convey ideas that to these people were more than real. It's the best way I can describe it. Most people have a very negative connotation to the word myth, and usually it's just because they don't read enough technical books, because technical books don't look at myth as a negative thing at
Yeah.
all. All right. So that's the first thing. It's not history. It's shaped, it's embellished, and in some cases it's mythicized. The second point is we shouldn't be reading Genesis to draw some form of scientific data from it. That would be a huge mistake, a mistake that we as Christians have been making for at least as long as I'm alive,
At least.
and that many of us continue to do. Genesis 1, as example, Genesis 1 and 2 is not how the universe actually came into being. It's just not why it was written. It is not how humans actually came to exist. The seminal core of the flood narrative, in other words, if there is a history behind it, which we think there is because there's so many of these flood narratives, is not a global flood because there's no evidence. There should be evidence if there was a global flood, and there is no evidence for a global flood. So we just need to realize it's not the way. We can't use the Bible to go and correct science. It's a foolish thing to do, really. Now, number 3, and possibly for me the most important one of all of these, we should not be using the book of Genesis to assess or determine the character of God, which is what we've been doing. I did this for many years. We use these narratives, these stories, these theological stories to show and prove what God is like. Once you realize that we're not dealing with strict history, you realize that this is a huge error to do this, right? And actually, this point will bring you much relief if you start thinking about this a little bit. But anyway, Genesis is not to be used to assess or determine the character of God. It is how he was viewed, he or she, or God, let's say God, just simply, sorry, was viewed by ancient 6th century Israelites. That was their view of what God was like in their journey out from a predominant polytheistic pagan society as they were moving towards more monotheistic views. They were trying to make sense of their world, but in the language of their ancient context. And just as we have left many of their ideas in the dust, their ideas about God should not necessarily be our ideas about God.
Yeah.
Right? They used Mesopotamian ancient cosmology in Genesis 1, and for most part, they used ancient human perspectives on who God needs to be from their point of view. And what you would normally find, an ancient primitive view of God is basically a human with superpowers. The best theological and moral perspective to read Genesis from is to realize that it is part of an ancient journey. The ancient journey of mankind on a very long path to discover who God is and who we ourselves are. It forms part of the beginning of that trajectory. It's not the end. It's not the final word on who God is, or the final word on all theological or moral issues that we all have to now revert to because that's the right way. The ancient Israelite way is not the right way. And their view of God is most probably not the right view of God. Right. So it is what it says it is. Genesis is an origin. It's not the end. It's not where we rest our theological struggles and our theological wrestlings with who God is and who we are. Right? It's our beginning. We start our journey there. If you want a religious education, start your journey there, but you can't land there. It's something sacred. Possibly we'd say it's inspired. We can use it as a base, as a lift-off place, as a starting point. But it is not the destination for us Christians.
It's the tiniest speck of the beginning.
Yeah.
Because the journey is so long. Time is so long.
Journey is so long.
God is so big.
He's a little bit bigger than what ancient Israelites.
Than their capacity.
Yes.
It's like, as you're speaking, it's just so like incredible to think. And it's like me going to read the diary of my great-great-grandfather of how he believes we're going to communicate in the future. And he thinks like pigeon mail or, that is really, that is the reality and the truth of what communication is. And we're sitting here going, hello, Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
Like, but you could, that was such a tiny part of your understanding then. And how if we only just stayed zoomed in on what my great-great-grandfather was talking about communication, we wouldn't move forward with even better understanding.
Yeah. And the reason we are locked in, so many of us are locked in on Genesis as this is how God has to be, is it's a dogmatic presupposition. We don't have proof for it.
Yeah.
We accept it because our tradition told us this is the way it is. And if you don't accept it, you're going to hell. So, okay, I'll accept it. I don't like fires. And then from there, we try and build everything else. And it's actually a disaster.
And we adjust truth or potential truth to fit the traditional mindset.
And the real problem is that there's real moral issues in some of these stories, which you can't get away from. And what I've discovered is most Christians have actually moved on a very long time ago because they don't live or act like that at all. But the moment you talk about Genesis, they click into this ancient view of Genesis, and that has to be the 100% truth. But it's like a cognitive dissonance. They don't live like that at all, but in their mind, that's the truth. So we have to be careful. So I want to imply a little bit of shock therapy in my final words today. We Christians, we have to come to terms with the fact that the earth is not flat. And there is no firmament that holds back the waters from above. It's not real. It can be proven to be not real. Right? We have to come to terms with the fact that snakes do not talk, and they have never talked. And that the human race did not come from two people in the garden in Mesopotamia. It can be proven wrong. We have to move on from the fact that suffering exists. The fact that suffering exists has nothing to do with a woman eating an apple. Move on. God did not drown all kids on earth because he didn't like what their parents were doing. It did not happen like that. Languages are not the result of people building a tower in Babel. That's not where languages and the difference in languages comes from. By the way, it's another duplet I didn't mention. Some races are not cursed forever because their ancient ancestor looked at their dad naked. It's not how things work. Lastly, God does not require people to kill their children as a test for faithfulness. It's an ancient perspective that has to be left there, right? Theological stories from ancient primitive people told and written and limited by their ancient primitive knowledge, traditions, and beliefs. We have the privilege to peer into that ancient window, a sacred space to be looking back into, to see where we all come from with respect to the journey of discovering God. But now we have to also move on. And that's I think my final words is, please, let's move on. We're holding back not only ourselves, our children,
limiting,
but we are actually, what we don't realize we're doing more than anything else is we are limiting who God is in the minds of ourselves and of our children.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the real
The
problem.
real issue.
The real issue, besides the fact that we get happy when people who don't think like us die. It's a real issue. I'll leave you with that. That's the end of Genesis, and that's how we
I think that's what
let it go.
That's what they call a mic drop.
Is it a mic drop?
Wait, let's see.
No. I think we will continue next week with Exodus. I think I want to start the book of Exodus, which of course now is
Are we going through this whole Old Testament? Is that what's happening?
the second, I don't know, it's the second season of the mini-series. Israel is in Egypt. Where's the land? Where's the people? Where's the promise? What's going to happen? And I think so. Unless we take a different direction, but I think that's where we most probably like to go. If not next week, then in the very near future. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I hope you have a wonderful Sunday.
Yeah, thanks for being
here. Get some
here.
rest.
See you next time.
Yeah, cheers.